In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings stubbornly to valleys that time itself seems to have abandoned, there exists a documented case that has perplexed historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that maps of the time barely acknowledged its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously documented in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a record uncovered in 1987 when the old church was finally torn down. These journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally detailed, that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none have been able to explain how 2 young children could possess knowledge that defied every rational explanation. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they had never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred long before their birth. Most unsettling of all, every detail they revealed turned out to be absolutely verifiable. This story isn't for everyone. It's for those willing to confront mysteries that challenge the very boundaries of reality. Before we delve deeper into the Morrison case, be sure to stay with us, because the details we're about to uncover are the very ones most historians prefer not to discuss. And consider where you're listening from, because what happened in Kentucky may have happened closer to your home than you think. The story begins not with something supernatural, but with something far more disquieting: the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science still cannot comprehend. Kentucky, in 1834, was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where settlements like Pine Hollow existed in near total isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular community had been founded in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom, away from denominational disputes plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow counted barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, bound together by the rigid Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their lives. The heart of the settlement was a modest wooden church, built by the townsfolk themselves using timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had left a comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and important events. His meticulous record-keeping would prove vital in chronicling what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was well known along the circuit of remote Appalachian churches. Tall and weathered, with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships beyond his 34 years, he traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel with his Bible, a few personal items, and the journal where he recorded his spiritual reflections. Widowed for 9 years since his wife Sarah had died giving birth to the twins during a brutal winter storm, he had raised the girls alone in their isolated cabin. Rebecca and Rachel were strikingly identical in appearance, yet starkly different in temperament. Rebecca, born first by mere minutes, was outgoing, quick to laugh, and spoke with a confidence rare for a child. Rachel was quieter, more observant, often seeming to exist in her sister's shadow. Yet those who paid close attention noticed how Rachel often began sentences Rebecca would finish, or answered questions meant for her sister before Rebecca could speak. What made the Morrison family stand out was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories traveled ahead of them, of backsliders returning to faith, feuds being resolved, and awakenings that lingered for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate sermons, but the observant noticed that real change often followed private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been especially difficult. Late autumn rains had turned mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had to carry feverish Rachel for the last 5 miles. They arrived at sunset on November 15th, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was concluding evening prayers with a small group of congregants. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound weariness, not merely physical, but spiritual. Ezekiel's patched clothes and worn boots spoke of countless miles traveled. The girls clung close to him, Rachel pale, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed by fatigue. Yet their eyes held an alertness, an awareness that made Phillips inexplicably uneasy. Though Pine Hollow had hosted many traveling preachers, the Morrisons felt different from the start. That first evening, over a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips froze in shock. The rose blight had indeed struck 3 years earlier, devastating her prized garden, a private sorrow she'd never discussed with outsiders. When asked how she knew, Rebecca merely smiled and said she had dreamed of roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident, carefully recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal, would be only the beginning. The next morning dawned gray and bitterly cold, the wind rattling the cabin's windows. Pastor Phillips, an early riser, found Ezekiel awake by the fading fire. Bible open on his lap, his expression troubled. The girls had disturbing dreams, he explained. They often dreamed of the places they were bound for, but this time the dreams had been different, darker. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep but her eyes focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childlike voice, "in your church beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." A chill crept over Phillips that had nothing to do with the morning cold. There was indeed something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey. He had hidden it there 3 months earlier during a moment of weakness, convincing himself it was better to keep temptation close where he could resist it daily, rather than removing it entirely. It was his most shameful secret, confessed only to God. "What did you dream, child?" he managed to ask. Rachel stepped from the shadows, moving with the strange, silent grace that was uniquely hers. "The bottle is brown," she whispered, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket." A blue blanket. Phillips collapsed into his chair as if his legs had given out. She was right. The cloth was a remnant of the blue baby blanket that had belonged to the son he and his wife had lost 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a bitter reminder of his failures. As a father who could not save his child, and as a pastor who could not conquer his own weakness, Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with a look of tired understanding. "It started when they were very young," he said quietly. "At first I thought it was just a child's intuition. But as they grew, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain. That Sunday service would be remembered by every soul in Pine Hollow for the rest of their lives." Ezekiel's sermon that morning was powerful, but not unusual for a circuit preacher. An impassioned plea for spiritual renewal and a call to confess one's sins. It was what followed that defied every rational explanation. As the congregation began to file out of the modest wooden church, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the congregation and his respected standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes and asked, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it?" "Papa says God forgives those who repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months he had been skimming small sums from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment in a Louisville business venture. He had told himself he would return every penny once his fortunes improved, but the guilt had festered in him like a hidden infection. Before Turner could speak, Rachel moved silently to stand beside her sister. She turned her gaze to Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow regarded as the church's unofficial moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said gently, "your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere. That's why you hide the letters." Martha Whitfield's hand flew to her chest and she swayed as if the air itself had turned against her. Her husband had indeed vanished 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing into the night without explanation. She had fabricated the story of his death to protect her dignity and safeguard her children's standing in the community. The letters Rachel mentioned were real, occasional correspondences from him in Missouri, where he pleaded for forgiveness and spoke of his new life. No one alive in Pine Hollow had ever seen those letters but Martha. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation, speaking softly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they mentioned patients who had died under his care, not from illness but from his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they spoke of the son they kept hidden in their attic, a young man whose simple mind filled them with shame. To young Thomas Brett, they described in unnervingly specific detail his clandestine meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband was often away on business. Each revelation was delivered without venom or judgment, with the calm, matter-of-fact tone of children commenting on the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements was so precise, so impossible to dismiss, that the congregation stood frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his once orderly flock unraveled before his eyes, their deepest, most carefully guarded secrets spoken aloud by two 9-year-old girls who spoke with the clarity of witnesses to something beyond mortal understanding. But it was Rebecca's final statement that would haunt Pastor Phillips for the rest of his life. She walked to the front of the church, placed her small hand on the wooden cross carved by the town's founders, and said, "This is sacred ground. But it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room, and some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself waited for someone to answer this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's oldest wound, buried under 16 years of silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a fragile settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most respected members. Jacob Whitman had been the blacksmith and informal leader of the community. His wife Mary, a healer skilled in herbal remedies, was beloved for her calm wisdom and her gift in easing childbirth. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been 9 years old, bright, beautiful, and adored by all. The official story, recorded in Pastor Phillips's predecessor's careful hand, claimed the family had died in a house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies were found in the ashes, the town mourned, and they were buried in the cemetery with solemn ceremony. The community rebuilt as frontier settlements must. But Rebecca's words suggested a different story entirely, one the elders had prayed would never resurface. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of the last of Pine Hollow's founding families, rose slowly from his pew. His joints protested with every movement, but his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades. "Child," he said deliberately, "you speak of things that happened before you were born in places you've never been. How could you possibly know these things?" Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes eerily calm. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said. "Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll their father carved. Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith wore her blue Sunday dress and Hope was in her nightgown because she had a fever." A murmur rippled through the congregation. These details, private, unrecorded, were known only to those who had been there. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, eyes wide with recognition. Rachel's voice came next, soft as falling ash. "The night they died, it wasn't a fire. They came to the church for sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found. The church grew so silent the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud." Pastor Phillips remembered fragments of hushed conversations over the years. Whispers that stopped when he entered a room, secretive glances among the older members whenever the Whitmans were mentioned, flowers placed at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still reeling from the earlier exposure of his theft, shot to his feet. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice trembled. "They're just making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." But other voices followed. Mrs. Carter, mother-in-law to the adulteress Elizabeth, whispered about bloodstains that had once appeared on the church floor, stains that could never be scrubbed away. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the strange sounds that sometimes echoed through the church at night, Sounds like children crying. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier humiliation, spoke up with clinical detachment. I've always wondered about the church's foundation, he said slowly. When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, what could have been, bone fragments mixed with the original mortar. The weight of his statement fell like a stone. If the Whitman family had truly died within the church, if their bodies had been hidden in its very foundation, then every sermon, every prayer, every moment of worship had been offered above their unmarked graves. Throughout it all, Ezekiel Morrison stood silently, his weathered face etched with concern but not surprise. He had seen this before. Towns shattered by truths his daughters unearthed. Secrets long buried dragged into daylight by the quiet, unwavering voices of 2 9-year-old girls. Mr. Morrison, Pastor Phillips said, his voice strained. How do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight? Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before responding. I've asked myself that question every day for years, he finally said. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, know details about events that occurred before their birth. He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess, it comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know. As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first time since their arrival, they looked truly like the children they were, small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. We don't choose what we see, Rebecca said, her earlier confidence replaced by a weariness far too old for her young face. The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be. Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly. The church fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and still others a dawning hope that perhaps death was not the final ending they had always believed it to be. Pastor Phillips found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as childish fantasy or deliberate deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability, or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk destroying the foundations upon which Pine Hollow had been built. The decision would prove to have consequences that none of them could have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hollow's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness, and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the more established churches in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Pastor Moriah Hayes, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1818 in particular seemed oddly sparse in recorded details. There were entries about harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents, but the Whitman family's tragedy was mentioned only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters Hope and Faith perished in a house fire on the night of December 21st. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. What had always struck Phillips as strange was the lack of detail about such a significant event. Pastor Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents, yet the death of an entire family, particularly one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with unusual brevity. Determined to understand what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips began searching through the church's stored records with new eyes. Hidden beneath years of accumulated documents, he discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the handwriting was clearly Pastor Hayes' own. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Pastor Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had discovered something disturbing about certain members of the community, something significant enough that he had demanded a public confession and reparation. The nature of the discovery wasn't clearly stated, but Hayes' entries suggested it involved financial impropriety and possibly worse. On the night of December 20th, 1818, Jacob Whitman had apparently confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that lasted until well after midnight. Hayes wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that would destroy the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated December 22nd, was particularly chilling. "The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul." Phillips set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered in the church itself, and the community's leaders had conspired to cover up the crime. But how could the Morrison twins possibly know details that had been hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal belongings, their physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still wearing her simple dress, but with her hair neatly braided as if she had been awake and preparing for something important. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "you found Pastor Hayes' journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation." Phillips stared at her in amazement. He had indeed found the journal in exactly that location, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to discover the loose stone. "How did you know where to tell me to look?" he asked. "Faith showed me in a dream," Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. She said Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual way she spoke of receiving guidance from a long-dead child sent chills down Phillips's spine. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what exactly do you see when you have these dreams?" The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment Phillips could see the burden she carried. "We see everything," she said simply. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't plan to hurt anyone. They just wanted Jacob to stay quiet about what he'd discovered." What had he discovered? Rebecca looked past him into the cabin, where he could see Rachel sitting by the window staring out at the church cemetery. "The money for the church building didn't come from donations," she said. "Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob found out about it when he was asked to make horseshoes for horses that belonged to dead men." The pieces began falling into place in Phillips's mind. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by frequent reports of travelers disappearing along the mountain paths. Officially, these disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers: bears, falls, exposure to harsh weather. But if Jacob Whitman had discovered evidence that some travelers had been deliberately murdered and robbed, "The church was built with blood money," Rebecca continued, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that should have been impossible at her age. "That's why faith and hope can't rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed." Phillips found himself face to face with a truth more horrible than anything he had imagined. The church he had devoted himself to serving, the sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and comfort, had been constructed with the proceeds of murder, and had itself become the site of even greater violence. But even as he grappled with these revelations, a part of his mind remained analytical, questioning. How could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate deception? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation he might have constructed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison family prepared for their departure, their planned 3-day stay having already been extended to accommodate Sunday's dramatic revelations, a lone horseman approached the settlement from the Eastern Trail. The rider was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in the manner of townfolk with a bearing that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington, who had been searching for information about events in Pine Hollow dating back to its founding years. "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he accepted Phillips's hospitality. "Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville," Brennan explained evenly, "and among his effects we found documents suggesting he had business dealings with this community in its early years. I'm attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred." Phillips felt his blood chill. Marcus Webb was a name that had appeared in Pastor Hayes's secret journal, one of several travelers who had vanished along the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. According to Hayes's notes, Webb had been carrying a considerable sum of money intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could formulate a response, Rebecca appeared at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of her appearances. She looked up at Brennan with curious eyes and said, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a crack across the crystal because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail was mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister as if summoned by some invisible signal. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said quietly, "along with his money bag and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson put them there after what happened on the trail." The implication struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, if Marcus Webb's personal effects were indeed buried behind the church, it would prove that their knowledge extended far beyond what any normal child could possess. More importantly, it would provide tangible evidence of the crimes that had funded Pine Hollow's early development. Brennan dismounted his horse with urgent purpose. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 73, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership council that had made the decisions in those early years. His weathered face showed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and position. "This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness." "Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan replied sharply. "If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts." Rebecca looked up at Elder Thompson with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "the nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you." Thompson's facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go." Rachel continued, her soft voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump, as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving. Our children were sick and winter was coming. But Webb fought back." His confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pastor Phillips realized he was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who had been standing silently through these revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of surfacing," he said quietly. "My daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply conduits for information that demands to be heard." Brennan wasted no time in organizing an excavation party. Within hours, several men from the community were digging behind the church, guided by the twins' precise directions. Pastor Phillips watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovelful of earth brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Pine Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 feet below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal was indeed cracked, just as Rebecca had described. The initials MW were clearly visible inside the cover. Beside the watch lay a leather money bag, its contents long since deteriorated but its presence undeniable. The horse's bridle, though rotted by years of burial, was still recognizable for what it had been. Brennan examined each item with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building legal cases. "This watch matches the description in Marcus Webb's correspondence exactly," he announced. "The crack across the crystal, the engraving, even the unusual chain link. Everything is precisely as his brother described it." But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that provided the most damning confirmation. The old man stared at the recovered items with the expression of someone seeing ghosts, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. "There were others," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Webb wasn't the first and he wasn't the last. The trail through these mountains was perfect for what we needed to do. Travelers came through regularly, usually alone, often carrying money for land deals or business ventures. The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Pine Hollow hadn't been built through hard work and divine providence. It had been financed through a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that had lasted for years. But even as the evidence mounted, Phillips found himself grappling with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Morrison twins know details that no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met, crimes that had occurred before their birth, locations of evidence that had been hidden for decades? The answers would prove more disturbing than any rational explanation he might have constructed, and they would force him to confront the possibility that death was not the ending he had always believed it to be. As the sun set over Pine Hollow that evening, casting long shadows across the excavation site and the church cemetery beyond, Phillips realized that his community stood at a crossroads. The truth was finally emerging after 16 years of careful concealment, but with it came questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. The Morrison twins stood together in the growing darkness, their small figures silhouetted against the church that had been built with blood money and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear, their faces turned toward the cemetery, where so many secrets lay buried beneath unmarked graves. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, who had finally found their voices through 2 9-year-old children who possessed knowledge that defied every rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Pine Hollow, bringing with it a delegation of officials from the county seat. Word of the previous day's discoveries had traveled fast, and Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time in contacting the authorities. By mid-morning, the small settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals who had been investigating the disappearances of travelers along the mountain trails for years. Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, had established his temporary court in the church itself, a choice that struck Pastor Phillips as grimly appropriate given the building's blood-soaked history. The entire community had been summoned to attend what would amount to both hearing and reckoning. Elder Thompson, his health visibly deteriorating under the weight of his confessions, sat in the front pew, flanked by 2 other elderly men who had been part of the original leadership council. Their faces bore the hollow look of men who had carried terrible secrets for too long. But it was the Morrison twins who commanded the most attention. Judge Harrison had initially been skeptical of claims that 2 children possessed supernatural knowledge, but the previous day's discoveries had forced him to reconsider. He had spent the morning interviewing them separately, trying to determine how they could possibly know details about crimes that predated their births. "Rebecca Morrison," Judge Harrison said, his voice echoing in the wooden church, "please tell this court exactly how you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects." Rebecca stood in the witness area, looking impossibly small beneath the weight of adult attention. Rebecca lifted her chin slightly, her small voice steady but filled with something older than her years. "Faith Whitman told me in a dream," she said. "She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She wanted everyone to know the truth." "And you, Rachel Morrison?" Judge Harrison pressed, turning his gaze toward the quieter twin. "How do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth?" Rachel's voice trembled, but her words were clear. "The dreams come to both of us," she whispered. "We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in their eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the dead?" Ezekiel Morrison rose from his seat before either child could answer. "Your Honor, my daughters have never claimed to understand their abilities. They only share what they experience. I've watched them reveal details about crimes and tragedies in other towns, things they couldn't possibly have learned through ordinary means." Sheriff Mackenzie, a man grounded in facts more than faith, addressed the twins directly. "How many people were killed along these mountain trails?" The twins exchanged a single glance before Rebecca answered. 11 men over 3 years. Most traveled alone with money for land purchases or business ventures. One was a preacher like Papa. He had gold coins sewn into his saddle. Murmurs rippled through the crowd at the precision of the answer. Rachel continued seamlessly, their pattern as unsettling as their knowledge. "The preacher's name was Samuel Collins. He was going to Tennessee to start a church. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on its forehead." Sheriff Mackenzie flipped through his worn notebook, his face paling as he found the entry. "Samuel Collins disappeared on this route in September 1819, he confirmed. "The horse matches the description exactly." Before anyone could react, Elder Thompson rose on shaking legs. "Your Honor," he said hoarsely, "I can bear this burden no longer. What they've said is true, every word. But there's more. Something worse than the murders we committed." The church fell deathly still. Wind creaked through the loose boards overhead. A hawk cried in the distance. "The Whitman family," Thompson continued, tears cutting lines down his weathered cheeks. "They didn't just stumble on the truth. Jacob Whitman was my brother-in-law. I told him everything, thinking family loyalty would keep him silent. But Jacob had a conscience." Pastor Phillips felt the world tilt around him as the confession spilled out. "Jacob threatened to expose us unless we made restitution. He said he'd ride to Lexington himself. We couldn't let that happen. Too much depended on what we'd built. On December 21st, 1818, we followed the Whitmans to the church. Jacob thought holy ground would protect his family. But we were desperate men." Rebecca grew very still, her pale face set with quiet resolve. "Tell them about the babies," she said softly. Thompson's composure shattered. "Dear God," he sobbed. "How could you know about the babies?" Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What babies? Explain yourself." "Mary Whitman was 8 months pregnant with twins," Thompson forced out, the words scraping like stones. "The doctor said they might have lived if we'd gotten help, but we didn't." Rachel stepped forward, her voice a clear whisper that seemed to fill the entire church. "That's why we can see everything so clearly. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only children who died. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls crying out for justice." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. If the twins were channeling not just faith and hope but also the unborn children, it shattered every familiar notion of the afterlife. Dr. Hayes found his voice. "I helped with the burial," he admitted slowly. "We saw evidence of the pregnancy, but told ourselves the babies were too young to have souls. We didn't give them rights." "Every soul matters to God," Ezekiel Morrison said firmly. "No matter how brief, but Judge Harrison's concern was for justice." "Mr. Thompson," he said sharply, "are you confessing to the murders of Jacob and Mary Whitman, their twin daughters and 2 unborn children?" "I am," Thompson replied, hollow as an empty grave. "And to the murders of 11 travelers." Myself, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry. We planned it. We carried it out. We hid it for 16 years. The two other elderly men sat frozen, terror etched into their faces. Sheriff Mackenzie stepped forward to arrest them, but Judge Harrison raised a hand. "Before we proceed," he said gravely, "I need to understand how these children know what no one has spoken of in years." Rebecca lifted her gaze to him, eyes too knowing for her age. "Your Honor, some truths are too big to stay buried forever. The Whitman sisters and their unborn babies have waited 16 years to tell their story. But how do you hear them?" the judge pressed. "What allows this?" Rachel joined her sister. "We don't understand it any more than you do," she said. "We've had these dreams since before we could speak. Papa says Mama had second sight, but ours is different." "Different how?" Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Mama sensed living people, their thoughts, their emotions, but we see the echoes tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled." Ezekiel stepped forward, his voice steady. "I've spent years trying to understand. Ministers, doctors, scholars, no one can explain it, but they've all seen how accurate the girls are." Judge Harrison studied the twins for a long, waited moment. "Miss Rebecca, Miss Rachel," he said finally, "if this gift is real, can you tell us where the bodies of the other victims were hidden?" The air seemed to thicken. Rebecca closed her eyes as if listening to something beyond mortal hearing. "Some are in the old mine shaft east of town," she said after a pause. "Others were thrown into Devil's Creek where the current is strongest. But 3 are buried beneath the church floor. Their bones are part of the foundation." The revelation that 3 murder victims lay beneath the church floor sent a collective shudder through the congregation. Pastor Phillips felt his stomach twist as the truth settled over him like a suffocating weight. For years he had preached sermons, offered communion, and prayed for redemption, unwittingly standing over unmarked graves. Sheriff Mackenzie turned to Judge Harrison, grim-faced. "Your Honor, if we're to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the church floor." "And we will," Judge Harrison replied, his voice like iron. "But first, I want to understand the full scope of these crimes." He fixed his gaze on Elder Thompson. "Where is the money stolen from the victims? What happened to their possessions?" Thompson's voice faltered as he gestured weakly toward the walls around them. "Everything went into building this town. The church, the schoolhouse, the mills, all of it was funded with their money. We told ourselves we were turning evil into good, that God would forgive us if the money served righteous purposes." "And their families?" Judge Harrison demanded. "Did any of you think of the wives, children, and parents who never knew what became of their loved ones?" Rachel's voice answered from across the room, soft but carrying like a bell. "Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and 2 young sons. Samuel Collins was engaged to Catherine. She waited for him until she died of consumption 3 years later. Most of the others had families who spent their lives wondering, hoping, grieving. The specificity of her knowledge hung over the gathering like a storm. These weren't faceless victims to the twins. They spoke of them as if they had shared their dreams and fears, as if the weight of their unfinished lives pressed upon their young shoulders." Judge Harrison rose. "This court will recess while we conduct a full investigation of the claims made here. Sheriff Mackenzie will oversee the excavation of the church floor and searches at the locations identified by the Morrison children. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal charges." The congregation watched in stunned silence as the 3 old men were led away in chains. 16 years of carefully preserved lies had unraveled in a single morning, leaving behind a fractured community forced to reckon with a monstrous truth. Their sanctuary, their homes, their legacy had been built on blood. For Pastor Phillips, the questions went deeper. How could 2 9-year-old girls know what no one had spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades? What did their knowledge say about the nature of death, about whether the dead could speak, or refuse to stay silent? Rebecca and Rachel stood together at the back of the church, their small figures dwarfed by the vaulted ceiling. They looked exhausted, pale, as though every revelation had cost them a piece of themselves. "Papa," Rebecca whispered, "can we leave now? The voices are getting louder. It's hard to tell them apart." Ezekiel Morrison knelt and gathered his daughters close, his lined face shadowed with worry. "Soon," he promised softly. "But first we have to help these people face what's been buried here." By midday, the sun cast hard, clean light across Pine Hollow, throwing sharp shadows over the cemetery and the excavation site behind the church. The entire settlement braced itself for the reckoning ahead. The excavation took 3 days. Under Judge Harrison's direction, Sheriff Mackenzie's men pried up the floorboards and carefully dug into the packed earth beneath. What they found left no room for doubt. 3 full skeletons lay hidden beneath the sanctuary, their bones intermingled with the foundation stones exactly as Rebecca had described. With them lay objects that tied them unmistakably to the dead. A gold ring engraved J.P., Joshua Patterson, the missing surveyor. A silver-handled knife belonging to William Morse, a merchant whose family had scoured 3 states for him. And around the third skeleton's neck, a copper cross described in detail years earlier by the family of Robert Chen, a traveling minister carrying donations for a church in Tennessee. As each item was cataloged, the truth hardened into fact. This had not been an isolated act of desperation. It had been a sustained campaign of calculated violence and greed. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison faced the community once more. His silver hair seemed grayer, his eyes hollowed by the weight of what had been uncovered. "The evidence is overwhelming," he said. "Between 1818 and 1820, 11 men were murdered along these trails. Their killers used the stolen money to build this settlement, then silenced the Whitman family to protect their secret." Thompson, Bradford, and Perry stood shackled at the front, faces drawn and empty. At their age, they knew they would die in prison. "The worst part of these crimes," the judge continued, "isn't the brutality. It's the calculation. These men didn't act in madness. They built a system, a method. They profited from blood." Pastor Phillips lowered his head, the words ringing like a funeral toll. His church, the sacred place he had devoted his life to, had been born of murder. How could he preach salvation on soil soaked with the cries of the innocent? Then Rebecca's voice broke through the silence. "Judge Harrison," she said, clear and steady, "may we speak about forgiveness?" Every head turned toward the little girl. The judge regarded her with quiet gravity. After 3 days of impossible revelations proved true, he no longer dismissed a word she said. "Yes, child, speak." Rebecca and Rachel walked to the front, standing beneath the wooden cross that had presided over 16 years of lies. Rebecca began, her voice carrying with unshakable calm. "The Whitman sisters want everyone to know that they forgive the men who killed them. They understand that fear makes people do terrible things." Rachel took over without pause. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The men must face justice, and the community must find a way to make things right for the families of the dead." Judge Harrison bowed his head slightly. "The court agrees," he said solemnly. "Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will face trial for multiple murders and robbery. But the question remains for Pine Hollow itself. What becomes of a church in a town built with stolen lives?" It was Ezekiel Morrison who finally spoke, his weathered face etched with the weight of reflection. "Your Honor, Scripture teaches that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children. If the children choose righteousness over convenience, this community can still be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and true repentance." Pastor Phillips found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. "The church itself must be consecrated anew," he declared with quiet resolve. "We will remove and properly bury the remains beneath the floor. We will identify and compensate the victims' families as best we can, and we will establish a memorial to ensure these crimes are never forgotten." Solicitor Brennan, who had been recording every detail for legal documentation, looked up from his notes. "The Marcus Webb estate alone is entitled to substantial restitution," he noted. "His brother has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds, plus damages for 16 years of suffering." Elder Thompson, frail and shackled, managed to speak despite his failing health. "The money is gone," he admitted softly. "It was spent over the years on community projects, family needs, and church upkeep. We have nothing left." Judge Harrison's reply was firm and final. "Then the community itself bears the responsibility. The buildings constructed with stolen money will be sold. The proceeds will go to the victims' families as partial restitution. Pine Hollow will effectively cease to exist as a settlement. The weight of the judge's pronouncement rippled through the church like a physical shock. Families who had spent 16 years building their lives in Pine Hollow would lose everything. Their homes, their church, their sense of security. Children would be uprooted, elders displaced, and a generation's fragile stability destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. But before the weight of that could fully settle, Rebecca Morrison's voice cut through the silence, calm but chilling. "Judge Harrison," she said, her young voice steady and strangely commanding, "there's something else you need to know about Pine Hollow. The crimes didn't stop in 1820. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind slipping through loose boards and the distant rumble of thunder." "What do you mean, child?" Judge Harrison asked, though unease crept into his tone. Rachel stepped forward beside her sister. "The mine shaft where some of the bodies were thrown," she explained. "It isn't just where old crimes were hidden. People are still disappearing along these mountain trails." Sheriff Mackenzie straightened sharply. "Are you saying these murders have continued?" Rebecca shook her head slightly. "Not by the same people. Most of the original killers are too old now, but others learned from them. The techniques, the places, the ways to hide the evidence. Knowledge like that doesn't die with the ones who created it." The implication of her words sent shudders through the room. If she was right, Pine Hollow's crimes had become a dark legacy, a hidden tradition of violence that stretched far beyond the original murders. Judge Harrison rose from his chair, his expression hardening with grim resolve. "Sheriff Mackenzie," he said, "we'll need to widen our investigation at once. If more recent crimes are connected to this place, we will uncover them." As the legal proceedings swirled around them, the Morrison twins stood silently together, their burden finally easing after 3 relentless days of revelation. They had given voice to the dead, carried the weight of unspeakable injustice, and forced the truth into the light. Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face reflecting both relief and quiet worry about the path ahead. "Are you ready to leave this place?" he asked gently. Rebecca's eyes swept over the church one last time, the worn wooden walls, the humble cross, the faces forever changed by her words. "The voices are quieter now," she whispered. "Faith and hope can rest." Rachel nodded, her hand slipping into her sister's. "But there will be other places, other voices." "Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness?" Ezekiel knelt to meet their eyes, his own glistening. "I don't know, little ones, but I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose bigger than any of us can understand." When the Morrisons departed Pine Hollow, taking their gift and their sorrow with them, Pastor Philip stood at a crossroads in his faith. Should he stay and try to rebuild what remained of the community, or turn away from a place so steeped in darkness? The answer came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father. If 2 9-year-old children could shoulder such an unbearable truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps redemption was not beyond reach, even here. 3 weeks later, Pine Hollow was a ghost town. The church had been dismantled board by board, its lumber sold to help repay the victims' families. The residents scattered across Kentucky and Tennessee, carrying with them the stain of the past, a constant reminder that their lives had been built on stolen blood. But as the settlement crumbled, a new story began to spread in churches and towns across the region. The story of 2 young girls with knowledge no living soul should have possessed, who had spoken for the dead and shattered decades of silence. Some dismissed it as frontier superstition. Others saw in it a divine reckoning. The Morrison family continued their quiet circuit through Appalachia. Wherever they went, communities changed. Buried secrets rose to the surface. Forgotten injustices were confronted, and whispers spread of twin girls who spoke with the gravity of prophets despite their tender age. Judge Harrison's final report on Pine Hollow stretched 47 pages, documenting more than 2 decades of hidden crimes. Its final paragraph would be cited for generations. This case challenges our assumptions about justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. Science may not explain the Morrison children's knowledge, but its accuracy is unquestionable. Some truths, it seems, refuse to remain buried. Pastor Phillips eventually settled in eastern Tennessee, where he devoted the rest of his life to helping communities face painful truths and seek redemption. But he never forgot those 3 days in Pine Hollow, when 2 9-year-old girls tore apart 16 years of lies with knowledge no living person could explain. The mystery surrounding Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's extraordinary abilities was never solved. Medical experts of their era had no framework to explain how 2 children could possess such impossible knowledge, while religious authorities were divided between viewing their gifts as divine intervention or something far more enigmatic. What remained undisputed, however, was the precision of their revelations. Every detail they shared about Pine Hollow's hidden crimes proved accurate. Every location they named revealed exactly the evidence they claimed would be there. Every buried truth they unearthed was verified by independent investigation. Yet perhaps the most unsettling element of their story isn't what they revealed about history. It's what their abilities implied about the nature of justice itself. If the dead truly cannot rest until their murders are acknowledged, if innocence can transcend the grave to demand accountability, then perhaps moral consequence extends far beyond the reach of mortal life. The Morrison twins disappeared from the historical record sometime during the 1840s, their fate remaining as mysterious as their powers. Some accounts suggest they continued their father's ministry, bringing buried secrets to light in settlements scattered across the American frontier. Others claim they learned to suppress their gift and lived quietly, far removed from the circuit churches where their legend began. But in the most remote corners of Appalachia, where old secrets linger like fog and unsolved crimes cast long shadows, there are those who claim to have encountered twin sisters who know things no living person should. These travelers speak of girls who can describe the dead with intimate familiarity, who unearth truths hidden for generations, and who remind the guilty that some forms of justice are not bound by earthly law. Whether these encounters involve the original Morrison twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely remains a mystery that neither science can explain nor faith can fully contain. What is known with certainty is this: truth, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form, and sometimes it finds a voice, a vessel willing to speak for those silenced by death. The original Pine Hollow investigation files remain preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, open to any researcher who dares to study them. Judge Harrison's meticulous records, Sheriff Mackenzie's detailed reports, and Pastor Phillips's personal journals all align on the core facts of the case. But the deeper enigma, the source of 2 children's unearthly knowledge, remains as impenetrable now as it was in 1834. Some truths, it seems, are destined to exist in the shadowland between faith and reason, beyond the edges of human comprehension. And so the questions endure. Did the Morrison twins truly communicate with the spirits of the murdered? Could their knowledge be explained through natural means we've yet to understand? The evidence affirms their accuracy, but the source of their gift stands as one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American history. What's your theory about the Morrison twins? Do you believe in the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Or do you lean toward a rational explanation, hidden just beyond the reach of 19th century science? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, some secrets refuse to stay buried. Sometimes it's the most innocent voices that carry the heaviest truths.